We'll just give people 30 seconds to join us and then we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the, or good morning if you happen to be, in the mountain time or on the West Coast, and welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Pakin, and I'm a non-resident research fellow associated with the Canada's Role on the Global Stage program at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, as well as a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, from where I am joining you right now. We are very grateful and thankful to have with us three panelists today to help us discuss the final, fifth and final installation of the China Strategy Project, which I have been directing at IPD for the past several months, in which we are hoping to analyze and serve as a platform for the analysis of competing perspectives on the future of Canada's relationship with China from multiple different facets of that relationship. So for those of you who have not been able to attend our previous sessions, they're all available on YouTube. So please feel free to go to YouTube and look up the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, where you can find our four previous panels on the China Strategy Project, including a discussion on the rules-based international order and multilateralism and where China fits into Canada's vision of that in an increasingly rivalrous world between great powers, as well as the economic component of Canada-China relations in an increasingly strained Canada-China context. We've also held a discussion on the future of Canadian universities in an increasingly adversarial context between, and security-conscious context, I should say, between Canada and China, as well as a discussion on the future of Canadian multiculturalism in an era of multipolar competition and rising anti-Asian racism. So those are all available on our YouTube page, or you can go to our website, which is peacediplomacy.org, and then go to the projects tab and look at the China Strategy Project, where you can find not just links to the videos, but also to the many publications that we've put out associated with the China Strategy Project thus far. Today, as I mentioned, is the fifth and final session where we're going to be discussing the climate energy angle, as well as the Arctic angle, which is of course related to climate change, of the evolving Canada-China relationship, and indeed China's ambitions vis-a-vis those three different fronts as its power continues to rise. And for that, we're very lucky, as I mentioned, to have three excellent panelists, and I will turn it over to our moderator, IPD Advisory Board member, Wenren Jiang, who will be moderating this session. Wenren Laoshe, go ahead, floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. From where I am, Alberta, I say good morning, but I almost have to say good afternoon or good evening to everybody else on the East. And then our panels, two of them are actually in Europe, Norway and UK. So this is an excellent panel in terms of the expertise. And I want to introduce each three of them in order. And then we ask the three panelists each give a 5 minutes opening kind of a thought about each of the three subject areas in the broader context of Canada-China relations. As Zach mentioned, IPD is doing a number of China-related projects, and under the background of the current Canadian government doing a foreign policy review related to China or some kind of Indo-Pacific strategy, we still don't know the details. I think it's timely to examine different aspects of Canada's relations with China. And today's focus is climate, energy, and the Arctic, and they're all in some ways related. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Linda Westman. She is a research associate at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield. For those who don't know, she's based in northern England, or what I look at the map might be the central UK or whatever. And she joins us actually from the United Kingdom. Her work engages with the environmental politics, including dimensions such as urban climate governance, transformations, and justice. Linda's research is situated within the UI's Urban Institute's climate urbanism theme, and she's currently managing a fairly large project which examines the climate innovation in ordinary cities. And Linda's expertise background as a scientist and contributing author of chapter 6 of IPCC's assessment report 6, IPCC being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So she's right into this area in the middle of the actions. And she is also co-founder of the Urban Working Group of the Earth Systems Governance Network. And before joining the Urban Institute, Linda was based in the University of Waterloo with Canadian roots here, where she conducted research on sustainable business innovation. And Linda also, prior to that, employed as a senior policy analyst at the Science and Information Office of the Embassy of Sweden in Beijing. And therefore, Linda, you're well qualified to maybe give us a sense. What do you think where we are in terms of China's climate, policies, priorities, words, phrases, big slogans out of Beijing? We hear from Chinese leadership talking about, peak emission targets, carbon neutrality somehow in the middle of the century, but China is the largest emitter of CO2. So put this in the context of climate change, if you can, for us about where things are with China, and maybe we can follow up later about the Canada-China dimension. So go ahead, Linda, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me today. It's really great to talk about these issues. China and climate change is a huge topic, so there are lots of things we could dig into there, but I'll use a starting point which you just handed over to me, which is that there is a lot of debate about peak emissions and carbon neutrality. So what is China actually intending to do, and what might be the implications of that? First of all, in terms of the intention of the Chinese leadership, it's perfectly clear and transparent. They are aiming for peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. And there's a range of other quantitative ambitions as well that the leadership delivered ahead of COP26 in Glasgow last year. Are they realistic? Most observers actually think that they are. In fact, China is on track to be reaching peak emissions probably ahead of their target dates, and also in terms of reaching the renewable energy targets, many observers think that they're going to overshoot. The political leadership in China is extremely serious about implementation. And we can see from a historical analysis of how they've treated energy policy specifically, which I know that one of the other speakers will talk about as well, is that, for example, when they've set targets on energy efficiency, they've pursued them extremely aggressively. And we've seen that they have been able to deliver on these in the past, especially over the past decades. On the other hand, apart from it being realistic, we also have to think about what would it mean for China to actually deliver on an energy transition that is absolutely unparalleled in history, both in terms of its scale and its speed. And the social and the environmental implications of this might be enormous. If we think of, for example, a rapid expansion of the hydropower sector, and we will probably hear about this from the energy speaker at the panel as well, what is this going to mean in terms of ecological cost, in terms of, let's say, social justice, population displacement, and so forth? If we see an enormously quick increase in renewable energy technology like electric vehicles, for example, what are the life cycle implications? Where are these materials going to be extracted from? Where will they be disposed, and so forth? We think about the regions in China that are completely reliant on coal. What is going to happen there? Some of these are hinterlands, where they're so-called, the central government like to portray them in that way, where there might already be social conflict. How is that going to unfold if we envision an extremely quick abandonment of, in many many cases, new coal plants, what is going to happen to these industries. So they're very, very complicated issues in terms of actually realizing this transition domestically in China, which takes me to the other point that you're raising in your question in terms of how is China performing in the COP26, for example, in terms of international politics? We like to talk about climate change as an international policy issue, and that is, of course, because it has been treated as an international topic of negotiation, and the states try to reach an agreement at the Conference of Parties each year and so forth. In terms of the rationality of decision making around climate change in China, however, this is not necessarily treated as an international policy issue. It's mainly confronted as a domestic political concern. And there are lots of issues that are tied to climate change in China, including air pollution, which is a huge public health issue, but also other concerns like energy security, for example. All of these are highly prioritized agenda within the Communist Party. And we should also see climate policies embedded within a broader environmental program. For example, the Xi Jinping's vision for a socialist ecological civilization, for example, all of this is tied together. So it's not framed as an international policy issue within the party. In terms of their behavior at COP26, the targets that they presented were completely predictable. It is in line with what they had been saying for ages. There were very little revisions. But we have to keep in mind that while China was portrayed as the party that wrecked the deal in Copenhagen only 10 years ago, that is not at all the profile that China has internationally in terms of climate policy these days. There were a lot of bitter emotions at COP26. I was there, but most of that emotion was actually directed towards traditionally the global north, and in terms of the failure of the Europe and North America, frankly speaking, to live up on their expectation. China wasn't seen as the main culprit there. So China is really trying to hold on to their sort of a profile as an international flag bearer of climate action, and that ties into a sort of to the broader environmental ambitions domestically as well. I have several reflections on Canada, China, and collaboration as well, but you said we might want to save that for later on in the conversation, so I can keep that for now if we want to go through some of the broader reflections first.
All right, thank you, Linda. There are a lot in your brief opening here we can follow up, and I already have questions, but let's get the opening statements or brief discussion to cover all the other areas, because one part of the climate change and the challenge, as you mentioned, that China is facing how to manage like the use of coal. China is the largest coal user. So in that sense, I myself involved in many years of a Canada-China energy conference, annual meetings, including the linkage between energy and environment. I think this is where our second panelist, Rory Johnston, comes in that area as an expert. Rory is a researcher and widely quoted expert in global commodities markets, specializing in North American energy industry. I tune into BNN, and there Rory goes on a regular basis. So he is out there at the Bay Street, maybe providing a lot of insights on, Canada's energy and North American energy related issues. He's currently working on a variety of research and investment projects, including commodity context, and his independent commodity market research platform in that commodity context, as well as both in the public market portfolio and private equity strategy at Price Street, a family office. So Rory also previously led the commodity economics and advised a major Canadian resource-based bank on a variety of their banking credit committee related activities, overseeing the bank's official commodity price forecasts. And of course, Rory being in Toronto, a graduate of Queen's University and graduate degree with the Monk Center with the prestigious University of Toronto, institution. So now from Toronto, Rory, can you give us a sense? I just want to jump in, follow up what Linda told us. What do you see Canada as a major energy producer and China as a major energy consumer? What is the dynamics? Because we have two projects. Let me just start with right there. Trans Mountain Pipeline is going to finish expanding in 2 or 3 years, increasing the capacity to the West Coast from the current 300,000 barrels per day to 900,000 barrels. And then the parallel West Coast project, LNG Canada, $40 billion, the largest private investment in Canada. Pronounced by the Prime Minister, no less, that if we send LNG to Canada, replacing the coal, we will reduce the climate emission aspect of China. So give us a sense about where things are with the Canadian energy sector. And there's, of course, also the American dynamics of our export market to the South. So go ahead, Rory, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Wenren, and thanks for having me, everyone. So my view very much comes from a kind of a global commodity market perspective down. My background is very kind of political science, but over the last almost decade, I've spent most of my life kind of living and breathing the price of oil and the price of natural gas and everything else. So my comments are kind of mostly going to come from that lens. And what we're seeing right now is, I think the global climate initiative broadly, I think, is running into a very interesting point in that with COVID and with this kind of economic bullwhip effect we're facing, combined with a whole bunch of other factors, global energy commodity prices are absolutely astronomically, over the top. Global oil prices, for those that aren't aware, this morning, Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, was trading at about $90 a barrel, which is the highest point since oil prices collapsed in 2014. But oil, while tremendously, massive from the scale of global trade, and obviously Canada and the US and China and all of that, and I'll return to that in a second, but you've also got natural gas and, LNG markets prices have been multiples of previous all-time highs. Europe has been facing, exceptionally, I think 3 times previous all-time highs for natural gas prices, the equivalent of more than $300 a barrel crude. So you have all of these moments where, I think, from the perspective of the environmental movement and the move to kind of reduce emissions, you're kind of all at the same time. It's like good news and really, really bad news, because the good news is, well, look, these commodity prices are extraordinarily volatile. It's good, sound policy to reduce your national dependence on such a volatile input factor. So I think, particularly to what Linda was saying about China from the lens of energy security, this is, one more piece to add to that kind of growing pile of reasons that they want to diversify from kind of volatile energy commodities, but specifically volatile energy price imports. So I think that's going to be something that continues to play out. But at the same time, you have all of these immediate concerns around, oh, well, part of that price explosion is because we don't have enough supply. So you have this, really awkward reality where, we all know generally that we're kind of crossing this bridge of energy transition over the next 10, 20 years. But, the drive across that bridge is very much likely going to be, in an internal combustion engine for at least a good chunk of that transition. So we're going to need more fuel, more kind of traditional energy along that way. So I think, you're running into this challenge of where you're going to get it. And I think what you see is global energy investment is at this really awkward moment, because many of these projects are meant to last decades and decades. And yet everyone is saying, rightfully so, that demand is going to start to dry up. So where are you, an investor in these types of projects, going to put your money if you're not sure where peak demand is going to occur, where prices are going to be in the future? So that's running, that's causing an issue where, peak demand concerns in the future are almost kind of sort of bringing forward peak supply concerns to today. And I think that's the challenge that we're going to be facing. Specifically about Canada and kind of the US, you're looking at 2 countries that by and large are going to be some of the only sources of real global oil production and growth over the next decade or so. You're going to see some more from OPEC, but obviously what we're seeing right now is OPEC continues to miss their production targets. They're kind of lagging in. So that's very much contributing to this massive run up in oil prices. At the same time, US shale, which was supposed to be this quick response kind of new era of market forced swing producer, they're not really showing up to the party anymore. You know, we're still 1.3 million barrels a day, or roughly, depending on how you're measuring it, 5 to 10% below pre-COVID levels for US oil production. Yet oil prices are back at near 2014 levels. In any period before COVID, that would have been massive gangbuster growth that would have absolutely destroyed the oil price rally, and we're just not seeing it. So I think there's this, this reality that we're facing of, we know that we're going to need more energy, but no, and by energy, I mean like traditional kind of fossil fuel-y energy, but no one's going to pay for it right now. So one way you can kind of square that is, okay, well, that's going to accelerate the energy transition. That's going, lots of people have said that, we're going to have, higher prices, demand curves slope down and to the right. So, we're going to start phasing out quicker. The other side, I think, and the part that I'm worried about is that it's also going, whether or not it's right or wrong. Many people have claimed that part of these energy crises are because of ESG, restrictions on the investment side, political opposition. And I think what you're increasingly seeing around the world is pushback and blowback on that. I think risks derailing some of the very constructive energy transition policies that we're facing. So when we're talking about, for instance, the Trans Mountain Pipeline and LNG Canada out west, we're talking about 600,000 barrels additional for Canada out of a total production base of, let's say, 5.5 million. It's definitely good. We're definitely going to need the pipe space. It's not probably going to make or break China's energy balance, although any extra barrels in the Pacific Basin are going to be very helpful. Same with LNG. I think all of these are going to be globally traded commodities. And as we've seen with things like the Canada-China canola trade, it's very risky to depend on any single buyer for your commodities. And I think that's unlikely to happen in the case of LNG or Trans Mountain crude exports, but it's going to overall provide more of liquidity in these commodities in the Pacific Basin. So all that said, and I'll wrap this very quickly here, so I think we can move to kind of more bilateral conversations. I think that, as you were saying at the beginning, we're in an extremely high energy price environment. Canada, as an energy producer, is seeing boom times in terms of cash flows. At the same time, we have a lower Canadian dollar because more and more of that investment isn't coming into the Alberta oil sands. And when you're out in Alberta right now, that, so we're not seeing that impulse. You're not seeing that same kind of Dutch disease of kind of currency inflation that's coming with it. So that is less good from a kind of a Canadian consumer perspective, because not only are energy prices high, but currency adjusted pump prices are reaching all-time highs in Canada, even though oil prices aren't quite there. And at the same time, Canadian oil producers are making absolutely wild amounts of money because they're not investing in new projects either. So they're seeing all of this inflow, and it's just going back to investors. So I think it's a really interesting time to be looking at this space, because we really haven't seen a period like this before. Maybe you could rewind, maybe very, very brief period, or post 70s, but I think particularly for Canada, we've never had this base of productive capacity and an opportunity to monetize it like we have right now. On the flip side, in China, I think if anything, this is just going to double down and accelerate their requirement and their kind of feeling of urgency for trying to sever themselves from these volatile, kind of globally determined prices. Because I am not a China expert by any means, but the one thing I know about China is that they really don't love depending on anyone else. And I think this is the ultimate manifestation of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, Rory, thank you very much. There are a lot to catch up with. I would say you're rather a little bullish and optimistic outlook on the energy market. I remember the not so old but good days in Alberta, about 10 years ago with the boom until 2014. You're saying now we're up there again in some ways, but quite different from before. There are new dynamics. But I want to follow up later, but let's go to Mark, our third panelist. Mark Linking is actually joining us from Norway, and he is an associate professor of political science at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, Tromsø. Sorry, Mark, I don't even know where it is, but you may come in to help us to maybe look at the angle of both climate policies as well as resource and energy extraction in terms of Canada, the Arctic countries, and China, which is quite aggressively coming in. So, and Mark's research interests here include China and East Asian foreign policy, China's engagement and cooperation with regional and international organizations, Sino-European and Sino-Polar relations, and trade politics and China's commercial diplomacy. And I know Mark for a couple of decades. I remember him after his PhD at McGill University in early 2000. He has been publishing tons of stuff. He's the author of the China and the International Institutions, Alternative Paths to Global Power in 2005. That's his book. And the Chinese Foreign Policy, an Introduction. This is the multi-edition book that Mark has been updating 2009, 13, 15, and the latest edition 2019. So if you're teaching on Chinese foreign policy, this will be a good textbook. And he's also co-author of the Chinese Party State in the 21st Century, Adoption and the Reinvention of Legitimacy, back in 2008. And another volume, he edited China's Evolving Approach to Peacekeeping in 2012. And relevant to today's topic, his volume on China and the Nordic Diplomacy in 2017, and the Routledge Handbook of Arctic Security, that is a prestigious publisher on a very important topic. And he is actually the author of that back in 2020, only a couple of years ago. So Mark, good to see you again, joining us from Norway. You have heard Linda and Rory. Jump in, give us a sense about how aggressive China is in the Arctic region, why it's relevant to Canada-China relations. Does it say anything at all about potential energy extraction and the implications of that and the climate change? Okay, go ahead, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Wenren. Thank you, everyone, and happy Year of the Tiger to everyone. It's great to be here. And talking about China and the Arctic, it is definitely an interesting topic, especially up here. We're coming up on the 5th anniversary of the release of China's white paper on the Arctic. But even after 5 years, we're still waiting for a lot of China's Arctic policy to solidify. I can say at this point, though, that we're seeing some very kind of specific paths that China is trying to take in order to present itself, promote itself as a regional stakeholder. Now, first and foremost, China is very interested in scientific diplomacy. With the situation with climate change in the Arctic, and pretty much every week, every month, we're seeing new papers, new reports come out about the climate change situation here. We are seeing mounting evidence in the form of rainfall, forest fires, permafrost loss, to really kind of demonstrate just what is happening up here in the Arctic. And China's made it very clear that it wants to work with Arctic states, including Canada, in order to better understand how these changes are going to affect China itself. And again, I could list many different areas that China is concerned about, including changing weather patterns within China, pollution patterns, and so forth. Now, scientific diplomacy has been very difficult, though, because there's been a lot of concern, including here in Norway, about the possibility of some of this data that China is collecting being dual use in nature. So in other words, what kind of information gathered in the Arctic could it potentially be used for strategic purposes? But it is really important to note that China is still very much a newcomer in the Arctic and is still trying to find its way, not only in regards to, let's say, government to government relations, but also the situation on the ground. The second stream, and this is the one that I think is probably getting the most coverage, and it goes back to the ideas of energy and fossil fuels, is that China wants to be an economic stakeholder. For more than 5 years now, China and Russia have been cooperating on the development of the Polar Silk Road to expand the Belt and Road project to the Arctic, to set up all kinds of different joint ventures. Oil and gas is certainly one aspect, but China is also very interested in the area of shipping. And this is something which has gotten Norway's attention and has certainly gotten Canada's attention, because it is only a matter of time before Canada's Northwest Passage begins to be looked at by China and by many other countries as an emerging conduit for maritime trade, connecting North America, Europe, Asia. And one question is Canada ready for that? Because China's made it very clear that it does see, and it was even included in the white paper, it does see the Northwest Passage as an emerging trade route. So the Polar Silk Road has been developing very quickly in terms of China-Russia cooperation. There's been all kinds of projects, the most prestigious of this being the Yamal liquefied natural gas project, which has begun to branch out quite a bit. And as was noted, with energy prices certainly uncertain right now, China's trying to put itself in position to really take advantage of what is seen as a rise in prices and rise of demand of oil and gas. That said, though, there's still the question about, once you go beyond Russia, where does the Polar Silk Road go? And this is something up in northern Norway there's been quite a bit of discussion about. Are we going to be seeing Chinese cargo vessels come by Tromsø and Kirkenes and some of the other major port cities here? What will this mean for European trade? So all of this is still being looked at. And the third branch, and this is the one which I think is still taking shape, but it is one which is certainly of importance here in northern Norway as well. So I'm in Tromsø, which is located at 69 degrees north, which is right on the Arctic Ocean. And just down the road from here is the Secretariat of the Arctic Council, which used to be a very small group, didn't get a lot of headlines, but goodness, it is getting a lot of international attention now. China is one of several non-Arctic states who have come out and said, okay, we are not Arctic states, but we are Arctic stakeholders. I can point also to Germany, UK, France, Japan, and Korea. Even Singapore has said, well, we're not an Arctic state, but we are an Arctic stakeholder. But China is the one that gets the most attention. China is an observer in the Arctic Council. So that means it does not have voting power, but it can certainly participate in council projects. And that's fine. This is something which Beijing is quite pleased with. But let's go forward 10 years into the future when we start to see the Arctic open up even more, even potentially the Central Arctic could be used for shipping. More economic projects begin to appear. What will China's view be then? And Chinese policymakers have made it very clear that while it is not an Arctic state, it is a near Arctic state. And that has been interpreted in so many different ways. But one point which is being made by Beijing is that there should be considerable participation by non-Arctic states in areas of governance. And we've seen examples of this. China was a major participant in the Polar Code a few years ago, which regulates civilian traffic up here. It has also been a signatory to the Central Arctic Fishing Moratorium. So China really wants to press the point that it has quite a bit to do in the region. How Canada is going to respond to that is going to be very important, considering that Canada has traditionally been very concerned about Arctic sovereignty. It has been concerned about making sure that Arctic states get priority in Arctic affairs. And yet we are seeing a situation whereby so much of the Arctic is being internationalized, especially economically. So how Canada is going to respond to that, not only in regards to China's interests, but also other actors in the international community, is going to be very key in the coming years. Thanks.
All right, Mark, thank you very much. Excellent. We're on time in some ways in the opening overview. All three of you really in this relevant subject areas put into giving us a very good context. What we will do in the next half an hour, 40 minutes, is to follow up probably with 2 rounds of discussions, follow up with some of the points that I want to pick up when I'm making notes listening to you. Maybe the first round of discussion is more focused on further analysis of the issues related. And then the second round, before I turn to questions from our participants audience, would be on policy dimensions, like what we do in terms of Canada's policy making, towards China, your recommendations, etc. But let me start the follow-up fresh with Mark. You're here, just finished talking about many things you touched upon. But let me put this in a very straightforward way. We have people, and all of you have Canadian backgrounds and probably follow this closely. We have a debate going on, and many, especially after the Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels crisis, are feeling very resentful about how China has done regarding the two Michaels. They totally feel our approach to Meng Wanzhou is acceptable, and the Chinese, of course, thought and accused us of taking hostage in the first place. But there's a sense that we cannot forget and we cannot forgive. Even the two Michaels are home. And therefore, the new Canadian policy towards China has to be based on that. My personal view is we need some anger management, but the mainstream talk is to get tough on China. Put that in the context of climate and energy issues in the Arctic. Is China our potential enemy of some sort, as some people actually openly advocate? Should we line up, maybe Americans with Norwegians, with other Arctic states, to see a potential Russian-Chinese lineup? I mean, what is it we're talking about here? You're saying China is a newcomer, but if the trade is opening up, China has sent 50,000 in the past, 4 or 5 years since they started the China Central European train express. They have 50,000 train running. Would they run that kind of thing as trading routes to the Arctic waters in 10 years' time? What we're looking at, will that be damaging to environment? What happens? There are clear interest and discussions and actually ongoing collaboration between Russia and China on the Arctic extraction of LNG and others. Give us a little bit more on that.
Okay, thank you. Excellent questions. I'll take this in two parts. First of all, to talk about Canada-China cooperation in scientific matters. So as I alluded to, yes, there is definitely a concern about cooperation under current diplomatic situation, but also the fact that certainly we know that there's also been a great deal of participation of many different parts of the Chinese government, including the military in various areas of the Belt and Road. So the concern is that any kind of scientific cooperation, the data could theoretically be moved over for strategic purposes. Where things get difficult, though, is when we talk about climate change in the Arctic, many of these reports that I alluded to have really underscored the fact that this is an international problem. This is not something which affects, certain parts of the Arctic. Certainly, we are seeing the effects up here in the Arctic Circle, but we're seeing so much kickback in so many other parts of the world that the stress is that we need as many actors as possible to address what is happening here. So there is certainly a great deal of potential ground for scientific cooperation between Canada, China, and other non-Arctic states. And we've certainly seen the possibility of that happening in many different areas, many different sectors. That said, though, we still have to get around the fact that diplomatically there will still be complications. Now, the other point that Canada is starting to express concern about, getting to your second point, is that China does want to open the Arctic to maritime trade. So we have the Northern Sea Route here, which extends from northern China, north of Siberia, all the way here to northern Norway. We have the Northwest Passage, and China is even talking about the Central Arctic, which right now is impassable, but it may be a very different story 15, 20 years from now. The point to be made, though, is that this is still going to be a very long distance process. Like there was an issue a few weeks ago, several Russian ships trying to maneuver around the Northern Sea Route got stuck. So we are not going to be seeing kind of a Suez Canal or Panama Canal type situation here for a very long time. But the fact is, it is going to happen. And again, Canada needs to work out, okay, what happens when we get to the point where other ships are going to be wanting to use the Northwest Passage. What can be done to make sure that all traffic follows certain protocols, is environmentally responsible, making sure that if we run into search and rescue situations, that Canada is in a position to respond. These are all questions which have gone from, oh, we don't need to worry about this until 50 years in the future, to we need to start looking at this now. So it's how to strike that balance between now it doesn't look like urgency, but the time is coming, and it is coming very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and one quick point about Russia.
Go ahead, finish. Yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
Also about China, Russia. Russia is basically China's quintessential Arctic partner. But that too has to be weighed versus the fact that Russia has put a great deal of stock in Siberia and the Russian Far East for a lot of its economic development now, especially under current diplomatic circumstances, difficulties with the US, difficulties with Europe. And Russia's also made it very clear on many occasions that it's all very nice. We appreciate international help, but we are the Arctic states, and we are the ones that need to take sovereignty. So when talking about China, Russia, and the Arctic, yeah, we need to look at just how much of an alliance would Moscow really tolerate. Okay.
Okay, so sorry, Mark, I loaded up with so many questions. Yes, it's good to touch upon these. Also, okay, I picked your last point and turn to Rory here. Rory, maybe the Russian-Chinese collaboration in the Arctic, well, there are limited things going on, we know, but large scale might be still a future thing. But the existing Russian-China, energy trade in terms of oil exports and the gas exports, quite substantial, as well as Central Asia pipelines. And Russian, given the difficulty with European countries, turning more and more to China. And you mentioned in your opener that China probably will not put its eggs into a single basket, China trying to diversify. But China has 75% overseas dependency rate on its energy, oil consumption, well over 30% on gas already, towards 40%. This is rapid, very concerning for the Chinese leadership. Is there something that we can do taking advantage of a higher energy output? As you mentioned, how do we balance this? We want to have sell our energy, probably diversify away a little bit from the United States. And yet the discussion today, as we have heard, is to diversify away from China. I thought we haven't even diversified away from the United States to get to China. We're about to spend $3.5 billion to diversify to some other countries. And some colleagues say, Indonesia, how can you do that? There's nothing there in terms of scale comparison. So get us a sense in terms of realistically, the Trans Mountain export and LNG Canada and others. Do we see another boom we saw between 2009 and 2014 between Canada and China in terms of export potentially and investment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think I think part of what I was saying at the beginning about how it's a boom time for Canadian oil producer cash flow is actually in some ways inversely related to the investment prospects. And I think part of what we're seeing right now is that the Canadian oil sands are kind of very unique in the scheme of global upstream energy investment, in that most of these projects are extraordinarily capex heavy at the front end. You're talking, 70, 80% of the total cost needs to be put in the ground before you produce a single barrel of oil. And they operate for 30, 40 years. Like some of the latest oil sands mines are going to be producing with basically no decline rates for 30, decades and decades and decades. So that's unfortunately for the Canadian economy and for the Alberta labor market, which obviously, as you were saying, had this massive boom in the kind of 2009, even 2007 to 2014 period. You saw, upwards of, $70 billion a year being spent just in Alberta energy capex. That, I think, the boom that the Canadian economy experienced was actually in many ways much more a construction boom than it was an energy boom. And I think what we're experiencing right now is the actual kind of cash flow benefits of these higher prices, in part because we're actually not spending $70 billion a year anymore on mega oil and gas projects out in Alberta. So, and that's not just because, I think the main reason for that isn't because of any political factor. I don't even think it's because of the pipeline bottlenecks, which have been, a rolling source of concern for the sector. It's because the entire kind of appetite of the oil and gas sector broadly has shifted away from these mega projects with massively long timelines to really, really short cycle, much more akin with the US shale. But, as I said earlier, we're also not seeing that right now. We're really not seeing much oil and gas investment of really any kind, which is where we're getting the issue. But I do think that as the Trans Mountain expansion comes online, I think you're going to have slightly overcapacity pipes, at least for a little bit, which is going to be great from the perspective of kind of call it egress security, of having optionality of where to send the barrels to the highest possible bidder. I think in some cases that'll continue to be the States. I think in other cases it's going to be kind of more Brent dominated markets in Asia. But I think same with LNG. I think those are probably going to go there as well, just because that's where the prices are going to be highest. One thing that, and I forgot to mention this in your first question, and you had specifically asked about how this claim that Canada is going to offset more polluting, higher carbon emission forms of generation in Asia, China, India, or what have you. And I think some proponents have claimed that is actually going to be a benefit for our carbon output or our carbon budgets. The challenge there, of course, comes around some of these, and this is coming out of COP, where a lot of the interest is around cross-border emissions target or emissions kind of quota trading. Because if Canada was to claim the offset, well, then obviously China or India couldn't. It is net zero. It's a zero-sum game here. So I think there's going to be a lot. And where I'm particularly interested in where this is going to occur is, can we come to some kind of international arrangements on the market side that would allow for, let's say, an Indian or a Chinese buyer to purchase a lower total, life cycle carbon intensity, unit of LNG and offset the coal, and then share that in some way with Canada. Maybe not all the way, maybe not, part of the way, but that kind of argument can't work until we get that kind of agreement in place. So I think that's going to be very, very interesting, because it is something that continually comes up as a talking point for the industry that will displace coal. So LNG investment is actually net carbon or net kind of carbon negative. But again, that's only going to work for Canada if we get those international agreements in place.
All right, this is exciting, because actually I have been one of those advocates since about 10 years ago, before a lot of people, when I was seconded to the Alberta government to advise them on Asian market diversification. I advocated that natural gas, LNG especially, as a transitional fuel to specifically targeting at replacing China's coal use. You cannot just export fossil, but the LNG, if exported, you need to extract some kind of commitment from the Chinese government. But the math is difficult, as you pointed out. So this is where I want to turn to Linda. Can you give us a sense about this dynamics? I mean, should we do the double exports of both more crude oil from the Trans Mountain pipeline, which is going to happen, as well as LNG, which we have been, if you listen a couple of days ago, when LNG Canada at 50% mark, saying we're 50% complete, 2025 online, and the CEO of LNG Canada is still talking about the first train of 13 million tons of LNG exporting to China will offset the entire BC's annual CO2 emission. So give us a sense if that dynamic works, and especially like China has so much green energy, alternative energy, they're leading the rest of the world. Do we still need us at all? There's one is the reality, whether it will happen. The other one is, from your perspective, should it happen, right? In that sense. Go ahead, Linda.
Well, that is It's a difficult question because I think ultimately that is a political choice, isn't it? And that kind of decision could only ever be made through political debate, in my opinion, as a political scientist. Should you be exporting it to China? Ask a hardcore climate activist and they'll say, leave all the oil in the ground. Otherwise, there's no way we're going to ever deal with this. Leave the LNG there too. You should do the shift right now. We have less than 10 years until 1.5 is going to be implemented. There's absolutely no way that we're going to reach that if we keep investing in more infrastructure, because we have to think also of the lifespan of these things. It's once they're there, as I think Rory already mentioned, no one is going to want to disassemble them. So these are long-term, long-range planning. If you build it, it's going to be there. We have to start dismantling right now. The question of whether or not we should be exporting this or that form of energy to China, obviously this, my point of view is that is a domestic political issue in Canada that should be debated. From the point of view of China's energy profile, whether or not that happens, that is not going to be what makes or breaks China's energy equation. Like, the numbers are just absolutely staggering when we're looking at the challenge that they have to achieve in terms of the energy transition there. So importing LNG from Canada, loads of observers agree that China will probably have to increase its share of natural gas in its energy mix in order to shift away from coal as rapidly as they're going to have to do if they're going to reach their own internal targets. But a player like Canada will not be the sort of the make or break actor in this. And I think that when we're talking about collaboration with China in these terms, in terms of, is China the enemy? How should we deal with this? There's a little bit of an imperial hangover in terms of thinking that the West is the actor that is dominating this field. We have to sort of manage China in some way or other in the best way for our own interest. Like, that game is gone. They're going to pursue their climate policies according to their interests, shape their internal policies according to what makes sense to them. But not only that, they're going to be shaping energy policies and infrastructural landscapes in lots of other parts of the world as well, completely without any sort of interaction with Western interests. I think Mark has already been talking about the One Belt, One Road, but in the context of the Arctic, obviously that is a global infrastructural investment project in which we see that China is already shaping infrastructural systems and energy systems in all parts of the world. So I feel like that train has already gone.
All right. Thanks, Linda. I can see our audience questions already coming in. So feel free for those who are online to put your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll try to have a quick read while going through now the third round of discussion. Then I'll field some of your questions. So if you want to put in, so go ahead. I see some questions already. But on the policy side, Linda, I'm just following up on what you said. Obviously, the government of Canada is saying there are areas we want to compete with China. There are areas on human rights and so on and so forth we want to confront China in some ways. And there are areas such as climate change. We want to work with China. That's very similar to the Biden administration and other EU countries' policies. But if you're advising Alberta and the Canadian government, I'm sitting here in Alberta with a lot of fossil fuels, and as a scientist who contributed on the IPCC reports, do you see this climate collaboration kind of overwhelmingly as a priority overriding other areas? Because one line the Chinese now has put out is to say, you cannot pick and choose. You want to contain us, our development, and well, in other areas you want to work with you. Either you cooperate and being nice on every front, or we won't do it and let you do and pick and choose. Can Canada pick and choose in its relations with China as a relatively middle and small power in many ways when it comes to energy, climate, and the Arctic, to be frank? Yeah, go ahead.
This is a really good question. And having worked at an embassy, I know that the individuals that are in the Foreign Office, they have to balance this line every single day in their work. So from the insider view of sitting in that context whilst in China, this applies to Sweden, obviously, but Canada as well, because we're all smaller than China is the reality. You have to think about how much pressure can we put on questions such as human rights, for example, some sort of ethical limits that we can't deal with, for example, whilst not completely losing the opportunity to collaborate with China. And that is a navigation that they have to do every single day. And the Canadian government is obviously already doing that. I don't think it is an either or question. I think that most governments are already doing both, even though sometimes there is a conflict and you might lose out on some options and some forms like that. I still think that the pragmatic line probably is that there is no other way than to collaborate with China if we want to move forward. That is what most governments in the so-called Western world, that's the option that they are pursuing right now. And from the perspective of China, there is also a very strong interest in collaborating in many areas of climate policy. When I was based in the embassy in Beijing, there was an absolute obsession with what is called lists of open and closed industries, which are regulated by the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, which they govern essentially what economic activities are open to foreign investors. And there we see very clearly that they've always been very, very welcoming to all forms of environmental protection technology, be it in renewable energy, soil sanitation, vehicles, whatever, all of it. They want all of it. So the path is basically open for collaboration there, but we have to keep in mind what are the social justice implications. For example, they can't be an uncritical just export to collaboration in that field.
Okay, Linda, thank you for responding to those difficult policy options here for the Canadian policymakers. I'm looking at the clock. We're almost approaching the 1 hour mark. We're going to make it an hour and 15 minutes. So we're going to extend it by 15 minutes officially. So for those questions coming in, I would like to field them. But quickly, I want to turn the third round to Rory, follow up on Linda's points here. But on the energy front, Rory, should we play nice with China in terms of our relationship overall? Because the Chinese think long-term and Chinese think strategically. They will not come in, as we can see from the cases of Australia, Lithuania, and all that's going on. China sees overall relations to be nice, to be good, the precondition of large-scale strategic collaborations on the trade front. So can we persuade the Chinese to buy our oil and even LNG in 2 to 3 years' time if the bilateral relations on the political side especially stay as it is? If not, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my position here is that the best way to position ourselves for that future relationship, not knowing exactly what it's going to look like, of course, never knowing what the next kind of diplomatic blowup is going to be. But if we're prepared and we have the capacity to supply this energy to these markets, it's not like if China stops buying our crude, no one else in Asia Pacific is going to have the capacity to absorb 600,000 barrels or 40 million tons annually of LNG. Like there's a lot of demand security in Asia for all of these fuels. And the other thing I'll say, just to Linda's point at the very beginning about the idea of infrastructure lock-in, I think that's a very important thing to consider here. But I also think, unfortunately, given the scale and urgency of climate change and the requirements to kind of keep us all from freezing to death in the winter in the interim, we're going to probably, unfortunately, need a bunch of infrastructure that might not be used for its entire economically useful life. And I think that we're going to need to overbuild these systems in order to have spare capacity and particularly spare dispatchable capacity. So let's say, a great example is what we saw this summer in Europe and Linda's in the UK. The UK had a really, really hot month in the summer, and the wind just stopped basically blowing. So you lost upwards of 20% of your grid supply. And then you had to basically import gas from an already gas-starved Europe. So I think in that kind of environment, we'll be in a good spot. One, I think it's always good to have extra supply, even if it's not on a steady state assumed to be economic, because you're going to have these rolling crises again and again. And one or two of these crises makes up for a decade of kind of meager pricing. So I think that's the first point. And the second point is, when we look at, let's say, the canola crisis, where we're trying to stop buying Canadian canola exports. The other thing is that they were in a particular position. So the politics matters, but the kind of real, kind of fundamental truth on the ground also matters, and for a whole host of reasons, related to the swine flu and all the other things, or the African swine fever. Mixing up my pandemics right now. It's it goes with the territory, but that put them in a position that they actually didn't need as much Canadian canola for that particular period. So it put them in a position that they could leverage that politics. So I think putting ourselves in a position to always have the ability and the flexibility to kind of change with the times and supply whoever wants our energy as long as they demand it, I think will be kind of in the long-term Canadian national interest. I'm of the mind that as we progress down this road of decarbonization, I would like to see as much of this production within Canadian borders as possible under our regulatory kind of eyesight. One, just so that I can play with the data, but two, so that we can kind of control and understand how that energy is being produced. At the same time, I would like to see Canadian industries or power grid consume zero coal. I'd like to see our entire kind of vehicle fleet move to electric. I would like to see us consume less and less of these fuels over time, while always having the flexibility in a crisis to kind of tap into that. But supplying the rest of the world with good Canadian energy, I think is in our interest in the long term, because absent us expanding, we end up in a situation, Europe for a long time underinvested in its own natural gas domestic capacity. While Asia and Europe were having natural gas crises, most of North America was more or less yawning because we have such an oversupply of natural gas that we were completely insulated from it. And I think that in that kind of scenario, you basically, what we're seeing right now with Russia, with Ukraine, everything else can't be divorced from the leverage that Moscow has been given through these energy crises. And I think the only way to counteract that in a long-term sense is by building up our own productive capacity to supply allies or whatever in crisis times, but have some capacity to supply markets in normal times.
All right, I just have a list of more follow-up, but we're running out of time on this policy dimension. I want to come back on some of you said during the Q&A, because I've seen questions related to what we discussed already. But let me go to Mark. Please, Mark, go beyond the Arctic region. Just listen to the policy dimensions that we discussed with Linda Rory. What do you see? You authored multiple books. What do you say to the Canadian government at this point that considering the Arctic dimension of China or not, but including energy and climate change, what would be a better overall macro level approach for Canada to formulate a sensible, workable China policy?
Okay, thank you. Excellent question. I would say at the onset that China is in a very interesting position right now, because on one hand, I would say that China is an Arctic stakeholder, and it is going to continue to be an Arctic stakeholder. And it is going to be very difficult for China to kind of step back from that role, because even though the Arctic is certainly not the biggest regional priority for Beijing right now, it is growing in importance. So the idea that China can somehow be kind of pushed out of the equation, that is simply not going to happen. So there needs to be ways of understanding that China is going to be a player in the region. Now, on the other hand, and this could possibly negate a little bit of what I just said, China is still very much a newcomer to the region, and it has very, very limited maneuverability, especially when it acts alone. And we look at the fact that China has put a great deal of emphasis on cooperation with Russia on so many areas, scientific, economic. A good reason for that is that China does not have the capability to really operate in the Arctic singly. It needs not only the assistance of the Arctic states, but it needs the understanding of the Arctic states in all of the areas that we've discussed right now. Everything from climate change to the Arctic to development issues to all of the major areas of governance that are really making this region much more complicated. So this is why China has really put forward the idea that there needs to be kind of a multi-tier, a multi-level approach to Arctic governance, which reflects the fact that the Arctic is becoming much more international. And this, I think, is an entry point for Canada. This is a way for Canada to say, okay, we can discuss geography in Nearctic states from now until tomorrow morning, but realistically speaking, how best can we strike a balance between our specific sovereignty, our specific Arctic policies, and the fact that what is happening here is certainly having international ramifications. So that really needs to be the starting point if we're going to be discussing any kind of serious Arctic-related dialogue between Ottawa and Beijing.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I think it's good. I'm going to field some of the questions and combine them in the ways from our audience. Linda, people are actually saying, let's do this seriously in terms of climate, policy, in terms of emission control. Should we, from now on, either China or Canada, actually require our new expanded energy sources be quote unquote clean energy only? In that sense, would that be possible? Like, maybe you can respond to that quickly.
Quickly, I'll try to do it quickly. I should start up by saying that having, for example, watched the IPCC process from the inside, there is a sense of overwhelming frustration and desperation among researchers who've been working on this for decades and decades, saying, look, world, we are really, really heading towards a catastrophe here. That is what's going to happen. That is really what's going to happen. We have 8 years to reach the 1.5 target. No country in the world is even close to reaching it. China is not even close, highly insufficient in their upgraded demands. It's an existential threat to our planet. So yes, every climate researcher would agree with you that absolutely our energy should all be renewable, preferably starting yesterday, but as soon as possible would be good. So having said that, if we look at energy, the energy demand in a country like China, though, we have to also understand that these questions are genuinely very, very difficult and also deeply political. There isn't any good solution for them that they can immediately adopt. Literally every single energy technology that they're trying to shift towards have their own social costs. A very rapid increase in hydropower, like I said before. Where are you going to do that? Whose home are you going to flood? What's going to happen to water accessibility in the lower riparian states, and so on and so forth. The extraction of materials for energy vehicles and things like that. They have serious costs in the countries where they're mined. Nuclear, are we going to have a rapid and uncontrolled expansion of nuclear power? Doesn't sound like a great idea to a lot of observers. Or are we going to, for example, do carbon capture and storage, which is a very uncertain and unpredictable technology in terms of risks? So it's not like governments are being deliberately corrupted or bad at their decision making. This really is a very, very difficult question they're facing. And they have to balance social and political aims in this. And we can only hope that that process is going to be as inclusive and considerate as possible.
Okay, I'll come back on that point if I have time with the follow-up. But Rory, I have questions, a number of questions I combine. They're saying Canada should be realistic at the middle power. Okay, we're already constrained by the USMCA on what we can do with China. There's this poison pill clause that we cannot negotiate a free trade deal with China. Not realistically now we're doing it, but in the USMCA, there was actually a poison pill, as former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross put it. People say maybe we should think about that dynamics because under Trump, the first phase of US-China trade deal was actually not consulted with Canadians at all. And they are trying to export tons of LNG to China. It's a competitor. Should we do something in that regard. I forgot early on to follow on this trilateral Canada, US, China energy dynamic. Some people even pointing out, maybe given the constraints, we should get some of the Chinese to work, relocate, expand their investment in Alberta. Was that realistic at all in terms of diversification with US and closer, other than just exporting LNG and crude oil? Is that possible? People are asking about these real job-related issues from Alberta.
Yeah, you could, but I really don't see a scenario where, I think the question was around relocating Chinese manufacturing capacity to Alberta to be closer to energy sources. And I don't think that's a very politically realistic option, just because, as we were saying at the beginning, China really doesn't want to depend on anything outside of China's borders predominantly. So moving part of your kind of core economic competitive backbone to another country is probably not going, particularly one that you have rolling crises with, probably isn't going to be a huge kind of it doesn't seem politically viable to me. That said, to the question around Canada as a middle power, absolutely. Canada has always managed to punch above its weight, both from a seat of moral superiority, but also from a seat of presumed moral superiority, I should say, but also from through these multilateral organizations trying to leverage these alliances where Canada has put a lot of effort. Now, obviously, that relationship with the United States has been up and down over the past decade, no doubt. And I do think that, to your point about connecting, viewing it as a trilateral, strategy with Canada, the United States, and China. Obviously, Canada and the United States, our energy industries are very different, but they're intimately connected, particularly in oil. On gas, we are direct competitors, because the reason that we're going to have to ship more, or the reason our producers want to ship more from through LNG, is because the United States has completely glutted their own domestic market and taken away any of our kind of traditional export market, particularly in the Midwest and up through the Northeast. So I do think that is something that could happen, but I do think the best way for Canada to punch above its weight is to actually lean in areas where it isn't a middle power, lean in areas where it does have a comparative advantage. And this goes back to the fact that we have some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves in the world. We have the largest oil reserves outside of OPEC. We have massive untapped gas reserves that have mostly been uneconomical mostly in kind of northwestern Alberta, northeastern BC, because of this fact that they have become economical at the same time that the United States has completely exploded in its own domestic production of natural gas. So I think that is how we can leverage our own unique Canadian advantage to kind of support in this area. But I personally don't see it as something where Canadian bilateral diplomatic efforts are going to move the needle. I think that we need to lean on our kind of harder economic advantage to put ourselves in a situation where we can assist allies, but also, work through those multilateral channels to try and reach agreements that we see as kind of mutually beneficial across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of complex issues, and I hope you have answered some of our participants' questions. Mark, actually, a lot of questions on the Arctic, interestingly, also conflicting in a sense. People are saying, well, Russia and China are big two players. Do we really have a choice? Russia has the most ice-breaking capacity out there. We really have, I don't have a choice but to work with them. On the other hand, there are people who are writing questions saying, look, shouldn't we be alarmed? Actually, Arctic security is being written into as part of some kind of a China's national security definition. Should we be alarmed in that sense? So how do you respond to these concerns? Canada, again, even being an Arctic country, we're a middle power. I mean, we didn't even mention the fact that the Americans are having trouble acknowledging our sovereignty issues, while China on that front is more accommodating. How do you see those conflicting views about the danger or the choice that we have when we formulate China-related policies when it comes to the Arctic?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. And it's going to be very interesting to look at how the Russia-China partnership in the Arctic actually develops, just based on what I was talking about before, especially in terms of Moscow's concern about its own sovereignty. Now, one point to be stressed, though, is Russia and China do not completely have the same agenda when it comes to the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
Russia has made it quite clear that its interests are very much strategic. There has been a lot of concern about Russian military activity in the Arctic. Here in Tromsø, we are quite close to the Russian border, and we've also had to deal with questions related to NATO's growing interest here. Whereas in China, China does not see the militarization of the Arctic as optimal for its interests for many reasons, but the main one being some Chinese scholars have referred to the melon scenario, whereby the Arctic is cut into 8 pieces like a melon, and if you're not an Arctic state, you are basically left out. And the worry that Beijing has is that militarization of the Arctic would almost prompt that melon scenario. So what China is really trying to play up the fact is that we want to be a partner. We want to be a very strong participant in what is happening in the Arctic in terms of science, in terms of governance, and certainly in terms of addressing climate change and economic development. Now, that said, when talking about China's security interests, this is also a very thorny issue, and there's been some very heavy debates on many sides. It is important to note that, yes, China has identified the polar regions as a quote unquote new strategic frontiers. But that has to be taken in the context of the fact that there are still many parts of the polar regions, I can talk about Antarctica as well, where China is still very much a newcomer and still requires a great deal of on-the-ground experience, which you can't buy experience. So China is still very limited in terms of what it can do militarily in the Arctic, especially keeping in mind not only worries about the melon scenario, but also worries about Russia. It's been discussed, for example, in Norway. There's a bit of a running joke here that Norway and China are very close neighbors because only one country separates us, but the country happens to be Russia. But it really kind of drives home the fact, though, that Russia is going to be the major player when it comes to regional security. And China is still having to walk a very delicate balance between not being left out, but also not being seen as a spoiler.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Russia being the largest country in the world, of course, got the size and they got the military capacity. But I want to remind our viewers that Russia's economic, in terms of GDP, only twice the size of Taiwan, is smaller than Italy and Canada. And yet it is, as we can see in the European theater with Ukraine, is when it comes to its own quote unquote security interest, when they define it, it could be very assertive in many ways under Putin. But anyway, we can go on with all these areas of climate, energy, and the Arctic, all related to several key aspects of Canada's relations with China. And we have approached each of you earlier to see if you want to write a piece for us. This recording would be uploaded very shortly, so other colleagues who missed this opportunity can go online. In fact, we have more people go online to watch it, our panels, than the live audience. And so thank you very much, Linda, Rory, and Mark from different parts of the country and the world joining us. I'm now turning over to Zach of IPD, our research fellow. Zach, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Wendran, for that excellent moderation, and thank you all to our panelists for putting together such actionable policy advice, and I'm sure that that advice will be very useful to leadership contestants for the Conservative Party leadership, seeing as we've just found out that Erin O'Toole has been ousted by 73 out of 119 MPs. So lots to think about on policy issues, including foreign policy issues for Conservative leadership aspirants. And for Canadians interested in the world in general over the months ahead. But thank you all again for joining us very much. Thank you for allowing our audience to benefit from numerous different intellectual synergies. And we hope to welcome you all to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy again very soon. 新年快乐, all the best.
新年快乐. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
再见，谢谢。